Hey Wargamers, Games Workshop finally released the new Balance Dataslate for Warhammer 40k. Now, if you're new to the hobby, not quite sure what this is, basically a Balance Dataslate is something that GW will periodically release in order to fine-tune the game, give it a little bit more balance as they see it, and address some of the trends that they've been seeing in major tournaments, for example. So, oftentimes, this is something that lifts up armies that are not doing quite as well as you would hope, and definitely tamps down on ones that are doing a little bit better than you might expect. So in this case, we have been anxiously awaiting this Balance Dataslate for a while because of the overperformance of factions like Custodes and Tau, and now Eldar as well, Harlequin specifically. So it's a much needed update and one that we've been anxiously awaiting for a while. So there's some really big changes in here, some really good changes, but also some ones that might make you second guess your army composition a little bit. So today we're going to take a look at this Balance Dataslate, specifically looking at some of the things that affect Tau as a faction, starting off with the general overall match play rules changes. Perhaps the biggest issue with 40k as of yesterday were Bodyguard abilities. And Bodyguard abilities are essentially rules that exist across a diversity of codices, across a diversity of units, that allow those units to prevent friendly characters from being targeted flat out. This is different than the standard Lookout Sir ability or Lookout Sir rule because there's no interaction. There's no if and but clause to it. It's just if a character is within range of this bodyguard unit, it can't be targeted. And that's a major issue because, for example, you can take bodyguards and hide them behind obscuring terrain and prevent those bodyguards from being targeted, but have that character out in the open and still prevent that character from being shot at, even though your opponent can't see the bodyguards. And so it's scenarios like that that lead to unfun gameplay, for example, but also really frustrating and one-sided gameplay because there's no interaction. There's nothing that an opponent can really do about that tucked away bodyguard unit unless they can, get over there and snuff them out. So it's a really interesting rule, but one that causes a lot of problems in terms of just the health of the game. And so Games Workshop has addressed this here pretty heavy-handedly. They say change the end of all bodyguard abilities from enemy models or units cannot target that character with ranged attacks to that character unit can use the Lookout Sir rule even if this unit contains fewer than 3 models. So that's a really big change, right? Because it removes that totality of the bodyguard ability and just says, listen, you get the same rule as everyone else, but you don't have to have 3 models. And that's fine. That's useful in some scenarios, but in a lot of cases, it's pretty redundant with the existing rule set. It does give your bodyguards some flavor. It gives them something that's better than nothing, of course, but it's not anywhere near the strength of the old version of the bodyguard ability. So now it only allows for Lookout Sir regardless of unit size, and I think that's a great change for the game overall. I think that again improves interaction, improves gameplay in a way that really focuses more on strategy, more so than just saying, listen, I got this bodyguard, I'm going to do the same thing regardless of what you do. That's boring gameplay. That's not exciting for anyone. So I think this is a good change. For Tau, though, that means that Crisis Bodyguards are not a really good choice at all. Crisis Bodyguards now are really inefficient, largely because they lose this ability to guarantee your commanders are untargetable. And so you are better off just taking more Crisis suits, right? Crisis Bodyguards themselves were really useful because they had the bodyguard ability, and you had to pay a cost for that. The suits themselves were more expensive, and you lost a hard point. You weren't able to take a support system for free, for example, with bodyguards. And so there was a real cost to taking bodyguards, but you got this really strong ability in exchange for that. Now you don't get that really strong ability, and you're paying more for a worse unit. So Crisis Bodyguards, I think, take a huge hit here. They do have the benefit of not taking a Force Orc slot if you take a commander, but really I don't think that's worth it, right? You're going to have your commander surrounded by crisis suits probably either way. And so, if you really get to the point where you have fewer than 3 crisis suits around a commander, you're probably in a bad point anyway. And so it might not really make a difference. So I think this is a really, really detrimental change for Crisis Bodyguards specifically, but a great change for the game overall. It also puts Crisis Bodyguards in kind of a awkward position beyond this, right? They are essentially a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, or a problem that has a solution now, or something like that. They're just like in this weird space, particularly because one of the stronger builds for Crisis Bodyguards was to kit them out with airburst fragmentation projectors and then hide them. So you could have them, a unit of 2, right? A minimum size squad, because you wanted to conserve points for your actual heavy hitters, your more effective units like your crisis suits proper. You would give them some AFPs and then hide them. And they would prevent your commanders from being attacked. And that worked out fairly well. But now there are changes to Indirect Fire, which we'll talk about in just a second. And this change that makes them kind of like, that would be a really useless tactic, really. That just wouldn't work out very well. So let's take a look at Indirect Fire and see how that changes things for Bodyguards and also your army as a whole. All right, so Indirect Fire weapons as a class of weapons found throughout the game were also a pretty big issue as of yesterday. And the reason for that is, again, like the Bodyguard rule, it made interactions kind of one-sided, right? It wasn't so much that there was too few interactions, but maybe too much interaction, because you, as a player that has Indirect Fire weapons, could totally negate any type of strategic deployment or movement made by your opponent that utilized terrain by saying, oh, well, I know you think that you're hiding, but you're really not. And that's very one-sided, not very fun, not very interactive. And so Games Workshop has addressed it here pretty heavy-handedly. And they say an indirect fire weapon is one that can target units that are not visible to the bearer, example, mortars, smart missile systems, maybe you've heard of those, impaler cannons, etc. If such a weapon targets a unit that is not visible, i.e. no models on the target unit are visible to the firing unit when you selected it as a target, then each time an attack is made with that weapon against that target this phase, worsen the ballistic skill characteristic of that attack by 1, and add 1 to any armor saving throw made against that attack. Wow. So now indirect fire weapons are firing at -1 ballistic skill and +1 save for your opponent, which is pretty wild, right? That is probably good for the game overall, because it is a really strong disincentive to use indirect fire weapons, at least using an indirect fire mode, right? So you can still fire them normally, if you can see the opponent and not suffer these consequences. But if you're really using them in the way that they're designed to be used, you're facing a pretty steep penalty here. For Tau as an example, right? If we're hitting on 4s, now we're hitting on 5s, which is a third fewer hits. That's a significant reduction in your overall output, a 33% reduction in your output just based on this change in ballistic skill. Now, of course, if you are advancing and firing an assault weapon or something, and so you're already at -1 ballistic skill, this doesn't stack with that, because modifiers to ballistic skill don't stack. But the change in saving throw will still affect you, right? So they basically get +1 to their save, just because you can't see them, which is thematic. It makes sense, but that's a big change for a lot of weapons that were heralded as being really good recently, because they actually had some AP to them. So this totally removes that, for example. So now a lot of those weapons are back to being pretty mediocre. Again, I think this is good for the game overall, but indirect fire shots are really just more pot shots now. They are vastly inferior to direct fire weapons or weapons that you can only use if you're, being a little bit more deliberate in your movement, let's say, or deliberate in your deployment. So it does favor more strategic positioning, more strategic play, as opposed to this kind of one-size-fits-all direct fire approach where you're like, I don't care what the mission is, I don't care what the board looks like, I'm going to be firing these weapons all over the place, pew, 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 okay, good game. Right, so it removes that. It does promote more strategic play, which is good. It really does mean that direct fire weapons are much better than they used to be. There's a much stronger trade-off between power and indirect fire. Many indirect fire weapons are not necessarily as strong as their direct fire counterparts. So in Tau, let's take a look at the airburst fragmentation projector. It's strictly from a math hammer perspective, worse than a flamer or a burst cannon. But it has the ability to fire indirectly, which makes it much more applicable or has greater utility in a vast majority of situations. And therefore, we've seen it recently perform very well because of that. Even though the math hammer doesn't play out for it being the better choice, it just works better on the battlefield. Now we are increasing the strength of that trade-off. Now we're saying that, you get the indirect fire ability, but your weapon's even worse than it was before. And so that trade-off really does promote the more traditional direct fire approach as opposed to that more utility pick choice of the indirect fire weapon. So again, we're seeing burst cannons, flamers are much better in terms of their output compared to airburst fragmentation projectors originally, but that's especially true now. Now that we're getting a third less hits and we're improving the save of the opponent on top of that, AFPs, airburst fragmentation projectors, are just a really hard sell now, I think. That, and they're even worse because of changes that have occurred in other places in this data slate, including changes that we'll talk about with Mont'ka, with the Farsight Enclaves tenet, and then also the Bodyguard ability, right? If we're not having Bodyguards hide places, then it becomes less necessary to have indirect fire weapons, both as a matter of putting indirect fire weapons on your Bodyguards that are hiding, but also having indirect fire weapons to root out those Bodyguards. So, I think that really does put AFPs, airburst fragmentation projectors, in the realm of being a poor choice overall, but can be situationally good depending on your meta, depending on the types of missions you're playing, depending on the board choice, which probably is how it should be, right? It's not that they are garbage and that you never want to take them, but they don't want to be your first choice. You're not going to be kitting your crisis suits out with AFPs universally. You might be taking one unit with a few in it, something like that. So you have that utility, but you're relying on other sources for your damage output. You're relying on burst cannons and flamers for your anti-infantry damage because they are just purely better from a profile perspective, but they also are going to have greater synergy with warlord traits and stratagems and other things like that. So yeah, I think AFPs are almost a dead pick now. Not quite, but they are relegated to being a utility pick more so than your go-to option on crisis suits. Smart missile systems are the other major indirect fire weapon that Tau have access to. So smart missile systems occupy a very different niche than AFPs do because there's fewer units that can take them, right? We're talking about our vehicles, so hammerheads, skyrays, devilfishes, they can take smart missile systems. We can take smart missile systems on riptides and broadsides, right? And in those contexts, the smart missile system is always a secondary weapon, right? It's always a support weapon. It's not your main source of damage like AFPs are on crisis suits. So here, I think there's a little bit more of an argument for smart missile systems. You're not giving up quite as much to take a smart missile system compared to an AFP. And their utility is still there, right? You still gain the indirect fire option. And they compare more favorably to drones and plasma rifles because of that. I think it does still steepen the trade-off, though, between smart missile systems and accelerated burst cannons or accelerator burst cannons. So those are the sponson burst cannons that you can take on hammerheads, for example. And I think that does become more of a consideration, especially because on hammerheads, you need to have line of sight for your railgun anyway. So you might as well also have the line of sight for your burst cannon. I think that makes sense. The smart missile system does have a little bit of play there as a defensive choice because it can help deter charges through terrain that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see through. And so that's good. But a major question that I have regarding this change is how it affects Skyrays, because Skyrays have a stratagem that allow them to fire their seeker missiles without line of sight. Does this change affect that firing ability because it's stratagem induced, or do they have to have this native ability to be affected by this? I kind of my hope is that it's not affected, but I think that it probably does because it just changes the ability of the weapon to allow it to fire indirectly. So my guess is that that probably is not a great fit for the Skyray now, which is a bummer because the Skyray was really a pick that I've been excited about because of that stratagem, and losing that ability, I think puts the Skyray probably back on the shelf again, which is a bummer for a unit that has been kind of on the shelf for a very long time. And of course, because Tower are one of those overperforming factions, we were expecting that there would be some adjustments, not necessarily nerfs, but let's be real, nerfs to the Tau Sept or to the Tau Codex. And yeah, there are some of these changes that I expected based on suggestions from the community, based on how the army was performing, and some of them that I was a little surprised by. So the ones that we kind of expected, or again, at least I was thinking were going to happen, were things like Broadsides losing core. So Broadsides no longer have the core keyword, and the thing about the core keyword for Broadsides is it took a unit that was already strong and made it kind of bonkers, right? And that's because the core keyword, of course, unlocks a lot of synergy within the Codex, particularly with things like Master of War or ethereal buffs, or especially like Shadow Sun and Dark Strider that have special abilities that key off of the core keyword. And so by losing the core keyword, we lose all of that interaction. And that's a pretty big blow for Broadsides. If you were someone that was really excited about Broadsides, especially Broadsides that were taking high yield missile pods, this is a big disappointment for you, right? Because this really does limit their utility in that way. They still have some stratagems that are useful to them, but for example, they lose access to Focus Fire, the Tau Sept stratagem, because that relies on the core keyword. So there are fewer things that you can do with them, but they're still strong, right? They still, especially with heavy rail rifles, they can still put out mortal wounds. They're still a really strong pick, but you are not going to be taking as many of them or using them as aggressively as you might have been doing so before this update. So again, they're still good picks, but you're probably not going to see a army with 3 units of them, for example, right? Because there's a stronger trade-off now between them and other units that might have the core keyword. So yeah, a good change. I think this is something that is totally fine, but it does change the way that you're going to build your army. Another thing is that they removed the stacking charge mitigation stratagem. So it says, add the following to the repulsor impact field and photon grenade stratagems. The charge roll modifier incurred via this stratagem is not cumulative with any other negative modifier to a unit's charge roll, which is disappointing, right? Like you could take a repulsor impact field stratagem, you could use the photon grenade stratagem, you could take a grav inhibitor drone and put all those together and basically mean that an opponent had to be right on top of you in order to successfully charge you. And that was, kind of fun in its own, mean-spirited way. But it also was very one-sided and meant that an army which weakness was close combat was even harder to actually impact with close combat because you couldn't get to them. And it gave Tau, again, like basically another turn of shooting unencumbered by melee in a lot of cases, if you're able to use this effectively. And so removing that stacking ability seems fair, right? It seems fair. It's a change that it removes that kind of, table flipping moment from the game. But it seems fair. And it means, of course, that you have to pay attention to where you're positioning. You have to actually pay attention to where you're putting your models. And that's a very consistent theme amongst these changes, right? Whether we're looking at the Bodyguard rule or the Indirect Fire rule or this change, right? It means that Tau as an army can't just run to the middle of the board turn one, say, hey, it's Mont'ka, pew, pew, pew. Okay, I win. Right? You have to be much more thoughtful about how you're maneuvering, which again seems fair. I'm not going to complain about that. Hopefully it's not coming off as complaining. I think I think that's a good change for the game. For us as Tau players, it means that we have less CP drain, right? Like, so we're not going to be spending multiple CP to do a redundant ability, which is, I guess, a silver lining. And it also means that your opponent faces less risk for charging multiple units, right? One of the things about having photon grenades and repulsor impact field stack is that if you had, let's say, fire warriors next to crisis suits and opponent was looking at charging into those units, they had to consider which one that they were actually going to charge. Kind of like how... Kind of the opposite situation of how For the Greater Good used to work. But this is something where, if they're charging those multiple units, they decide, well, I could charge both of them, but do I really want to risk having both of these stratagems pulled out on me? And so maybe they would say, well, I'm only going to charge the fire warriors because I don't want to have to deal with photon grenades and the repulsor impact field. Now they don't have to make that choice anymore. So they're going to say, well, I might as well charge both of them. You can only overwatch with one anyway. So I might as well try to get both. So it does lower the risk for your opponent for charging your suits. And again, reinforces that point of pay attention to where you put your stuff. Now the changes that I think are a little bit more surprising. They are not necessarily things that I didn't think were going to be addressed, but the way that they're addressed here is more than I was expecting, or at least broader than I was expecting. I was thinking that some of these were going to be addressed in more specific ways or more constrained ways, in particular scenarios, particular units, but these are pretty sweeping changes to both the Farsight Enclave Septenant and Mont'ka. So they changed Mont'ka basically to say, well, it says here, change the second bullet point of Mont'ka to read, each time a model in this unit makes a ranged attack that targets the closest eligible enemy unit within the range shown in the table below, re-roll a wound roll of 1. Period. End of sentence. That's it. So we're missing a really important part of that statement there, and that is improving the AP characteristic by 1. So that used to be one of the really awesome things about Mont'ka as of the publishing of the book, was that you got -1 AP if you were within 18 inches or closer. And now you don't get that at all now. They just totally took it out. And you still get the reroll. You still get to reroll ones, but you don't get the -1 AP. And that's a big blow for weapons that, didn't have a lot of AP to begin with. Right. So if we're talking about area burst for fragmentation projectors in particular, right, this is just like what's that meme? Like, stop it, he's already dead. Leave the AFPs alone. This is a big kick in the air burst fragmentation projector for them. So it's. Yeah, and burst cannons, flamers, pulse rifles, pulse blasters, they all take a major hit from this, because adding 1 AP, either added AP to the unit to a weapon that didn't have AP to begin with, or doubled the AP if it was -1, or whatever. Like, it was a really significant proportional change for those weapons. And that means units like crisis suits or stealth suits or fire warriors that utilize these weapons extensively are all now much worse off because they don't get that -1 AP bump on turns 1, 2, and 3. So that is a big hit. And I think that is going to take the wind out of a lot of people's sails, and make games much closer because you lose a lot of that turn 1, 2, 3, that Mont'ka bump that you would otherwise have. It does have the consequences of making strike teams relatively better now compared to these other options, compared to breachers, for example, compared to stealth suits especially. Strike teams do have a little bit of a silver lining here in that they still have access to multiple stratagems that improve their AP by 1, and they can do that at range. And so you're still able to get strike teams to have a really good AP characteristic throughout the game. That's not tied to Mont'ka necessarily. So I think that's a bit of a silver lining, a little bit of something that might make you think more seriously about taking strike teams in a way that maybe you haven't before. I think strike teams are a good choice in general, but this is something that I think reinforces that a little bit more than it might have otherwise. It also has kind of a silver lining of lowering the opportunity cost for being outside Mont'ka range, right? So like the fact that you don't get the -1 AP for being within Mont'ka range means that, maybe you don't have to be inside Mont'ka range. Maybe that's not as big of a deal to you. Rerolling the 1 to wound, that's still really good. But now you don't get that -1 AP, so maybe it's not that big of a deal if you don't get it, right? And that's good given the 4th point below, right? Given the changes to repulsor impact field and photon grenades. It's good that you're not pushed as hard to be within Mont'ka range because now it's riskier. So that there's a bit of elegance in that, I suppose. Right? And the last change that we're going to talk about, the second bullet point here, is that the Farsight Enclaves tenant is reduced to 9 inches instead of 12 inches for counting as having a marker light token. And this is one that I'm just a little surprised by. I don't know if it was totally necessary given all these other changes. And it makes Farsight a lot less appealing for me, at least. And yeah, basically, so Farsight Enclave Septenant has 2 main points to it. One is that within 12 inches, you used to count as having a marker light token. And then you also get to reroll a wound roll for a unit when you're shooting or fighting. And you still get the reroll a wound roll, which is good. But now the marker light benefit only applies within 9 inches instead of 12. And that's a pretty big deal considering you're putting yourself at much greater risk for charges and close combat, which, Tau right now are better at close combat than they've ever been before, and that's great. But we still don't really want to be in close combat. And so putting us in a position where in order to get the benefit of the Septenant, we have to be within 9 inches, which is basically a guaranteed charge the next turn. That's a little rough, right? I mean, it means that in order to get the marker light benefit, you have to be positioning yourself in a much riskier and a much more limiting way. Specifically, right? If we're looking at how to position a unit without knowing exactly what the battlefield is going to look like by the time we get to our shooting phase, we are limited in our options because we have to really dedicate to a unit in order to get within that 9 inches of it. We have a smaller bubble that we can actually rely on this happening. And we're also putting ourselves at greater risk of being charged, especially if we're putting our suits, or I guess our units in general, in a position where there's multiple potential targets nearby. So again, reinforcing the message from the GW rules team, like, hey, Tau players, pay attention to where you're putting your dudes, because apparently that's their biggest concern is like Tau players are not paying attention to where they're putting their units. And they're really trying to make us do that, I guess. It's still fairly easy to get this benefit though, right? Like it's still fairly easy if you want to do it to get the marker light benefit, right? 9 inches is enough of a bubble that, on turn 1, if you want to do it, you can with with all the tools available to us, including, stratagems and devilfish and cold star buffs. Like you can do it, sure, no problem. Turn 1 or whatever turn you want. Like this is something that's still fairly easy if you decided something that you want to do and prioritize it, but you do have to plan for it. And so overall, I think that this change means that Tau Sept certainly is much more appealing, and also makes me a lot less excited about Farsight Enclaves allied worlds as well, right? Like that's something that I'm surprised they didn't mention at all here is like the interaction between Farsight Enclaves allied worlds and ethereals. Like they don't touch on that at all here, but they do this, and that means like the benefit of Farsight Enclaves allied world is significantly reduced. And so, you might as well just go, you're much more pressured into just doing pure Farsight or going a different sept altogether. And I think Tau Sept is really probably the stronger way to go now because of that. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what that means for how the tournament lists start looking and everything like that. But yeah, I'm guessing that we're going to see more Tau Sept and less Farsight stuff because of this seemingly minor but pretty influential change. All right, let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, interested to hear what you think. Did I miss something? Did I overstate something, understate something? Throw those those opinions down in the comments and we'll have a discussion. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. A while ago I made my own miniature. If you are interested in showing your support for the channel on the tabletop, you can pick one up either on Etsy if you're in the US or directly through me worldwide. Special thanks to our sponsor, the Magnet Baron, and also all the good folks over on Patreon, especially Mate Monk, Marcy, A Little Pink Monster, Bennaby Jones, Durza, Ever Keller, Robbie Goodwin, Jose Gomez, Ruger, Drew Pratley, Michael Byrne, Zealous Brimstone, Scott Heater, Stephen Cowan, Jared Egler, Chris Kessler, Tao Oswell, and Shifty.